FromSoftware is in a arms race against itself. That's a quote from game reviewer Joseph Anderson's extensive review of Elden Ring and its DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree. And although he uploaded that quite a while ago, it's something that's just resonated with me so much because I agree with it in every sense of the word. And a lot of people disagree because as much as I love FromSoft games, in fact, Dark Souls 3, as I'll get into, is one of my favorites games of all time. It's a series with a very tribal following and one that very few people are willing to criticize or see flaws in, which I think is a bit unjust because no game is perfect, right? We have to pick apart the stuff that we love. And Dark Souls 1 was a game that paved the way. And I think it was the only one that can really hold that sentiment because it was so new at the time, so novel. I guess you can include Demon's Souls here to an extent as well, but it was the first modern game of that scope that didn't hold your hand. It didn't give you all the tooltips, guides, and clues, and tell you when you needed to go. It just said, play the game the way we intend. There was no difficulty options. The real macro loop satisfaction came in the challenge and overcoming that challenge, right? That's where it was about. Not about hacking down each enemy and beating every boss, really. As a whole, it was about starting this game from scratch, knowing nothing, and by the end of it feeling like you've truly accomplished something. There was very few, if any, games at the time that really had that feeling, especially by the end of it. I think back, although it wasn't my first one in this series, that was actually 3, Dark Souls 1, I could still see that emotion and sentiment that people shared after going back and playing it, beating the final boss. The game's old, so I don't care about spoilers, but beating Gwyn, there's just thematic presence of that last duel at the end of time, if you will, where you've become this accomplished warrior so far away from where you were at the start as a complete noob, for lack of a better term. It's powerful. It's so powerful, and it's why the game is, in my opinion, the most influential one ever made. I don't think that's a particularly hyperbolic statement. And part of the reason that was outside of the things I mentioned, on top of such things like level design, which is incredible for the time and still now, is, of course, the core gameplay, right? Which was, it was punishing, but it was totally fair. As I said, it didn't hold your hand. It shared that same, sort of core tenet, right? It didn't assist you in many ways possible. Every death and every sort of tribulation a player went through was entirely their fault. And again, that's so powerful in creating that motivation, that drive to overcome a challenge. It was, it's easy to see why that game was so popular and developed a cult following and became the incredible series that we now know it today. And as we saw with the later iterations, like Dark Souls 2, for example, which was, in my opinion, the awkward middle child, as much as I enjoyed some elements of it, like Majula, the sort of hub area, which I'll never forget, phenomenal score and sort of general setting, it was a game which I think was still finding its feet in terms of trying to innovate. And innovate is probably the word I'd use that's most important here in describing not just the Souls series, but FromSoft's entire game catalog. Because if you go back and look at how the games have progressed, FromSoft's idea of innovation has always been a little bit more subtle. It's always been minor tweaks in terms of the gameplay to create a smoother experience, but the core principles were always the same, generally speaking, in terms of gameplay. And the natural progression when you saw games like Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne a few years later, once that core loop of dodge rolling, blocking, and striking was a bit more ironed out, modernized, it became a much more fast-paced experience, which I absolutely loved. And on top of the incredible level design, art direction, of course, of both of those games, I think it's fair to say that those two, around 2014 to 2016, was the peak of the series, in my opinion. And I know a lot of people would probably disagree with me there. And maybe I am a little bit biased because 3 was, as I said, my first foray into the series and FromSoft's game catalog. But I think after retroactively going back and playing them, I think it's the perfect middle ground where the general concept of the Souls-like formula was still at the time just at the peak of its freshness, novel, and sort of general novelty, that it was entertaining regardless of which approach FromSoft decided to take. If they stuck to that core gameplay loop, which was addictive, fun, and clearly because people loved playing it. And I think after that, we started to see why I think this statement that I mentioned at the beginning of FromSoft being in an arms race against themselves, or I think another way you could put it is the Souls-like bubble being about to burst if it hasn't already. And if you look at Sekiro, which was their next release, if I'm not mistaken off the top of my head, you know, that was a bit of a different departure, and it garnered a lot of controversy because FromSoft went a bit of a different route. There was no multiplayer, no cooperative experience, and there was no build crafting, no customization. It was a very much streamlined, gameplay-focused experience, which I actually really enjoyed, and I think it might have been the exception to the rule in many ways. But a lot of people didn't like it because it was different to Dark Souls, and people don't like change. And this is the conflict that I'm getting at here. And I'm happy to be one of those people too, just in a different context, because when Elden Ring released, FromSoft's most ambitious project yet by far, essentially putting the Dark Souls, you know, tried and trusted formula into an open world setting, I naturally had a lot of questions, and I've talked about this at length on my Elden Ring video before, but I feel like looking at the whole series and FromSoft's games as on a wider scope is important for context, right? And I personally was never a fan of the decision to move into an open world because it's just not my cup of tea as much. I prefer the more streamlined, semi-linear and also linear formulas of Dark Souls and Sekiro, right? But that's not really what my main gripe was. I think my main gripe when you're talking about this idea of the arms race is the difficulty and the macro loop challenge, of overcoming that challenge, right? Elden Ring, which is the first, I feel, to start to struggle there, because what you saw was FromSoft raising the difficulty bar so absurdly high that it starts to take away from the experience of being, you know, a lot of away from being tough but fair, which was the general sort of phrase I'd use to describe the series as a whole, right? It was always tough but fair, and as I said, every death was your own fault. Elden Ring, in my opinion, was the first time in a few of the occasions throughout that game, as much as I loved it, and I think it's an incredible experience, that there were some exceptions to that rule, namely Millennia, the optional boss, which I will say, optional boss at the end of the main story, which I think was undone by one attack, which was essentially unavoidable and unblockable without an elaborate guide from a video on YouTube, right? And that's a problem because it was such an unfair attack to dodge that, you know, it becomes not about skill, it becomes about luck. And that goes against the complete core tenets and principles of what made the Souls series so great in the first place. And that sentiment carried over into the DLC because what you have is these bosses which are so absurdly designed in the sense that it's attack after attack after attack, and you're playing a game of just dodging just to get one hit in, and it almost becomes so much of a chore. And I didn't really have a problem with it that much in Elden Ring, the base game, nor its expansion, because I thoroughly enjoyed my time. I think overall the bosses were fun. It was a fun experience to go through, and I actually relished the challenge in a lot of many ways. But I think what the FromSoft ended up doing was, throughout both of those, was promoting the co-op experience more so than they ever did before, and essentially incentivizing it with the Mimic Tear, you know, sort of Spirit Ashes, and also the co-op summon experience, just amped up to a higher degree where they almost incentivize multiplayer play. And that's good for some, in my opinion. Of course, this is my channel. I talk about, you know, my opinions and the games I love for all of the reasons, right? And I was never one who enjoyed the co-op experience in combat-wise when you're talking about purely just on the gameplay side of things, because that flow state you enter when you're dodging and waiting for that attack window with a boss, it's almost like a dance, right? That is pretty much religiously constricted to solo play. You lose that as soon as you add another player into the mix because of the way the multiplayer AI is designed with targeting. It just doesn't work as well as you might have hoped, and that's why I was a bit worried when Elden Ring really pushed that side of things, and so did the DLC. And I don't think you can exemplify it any more with the final boss, which you know, spoilers in 3, 2, 1, you fight Radahn, a prime version of him, at the end of the DLC. And I think it's pretty telling of this opinion, and my opinion and my feelings towards it at the time, that he has since been nerfed to the ground and fixed in many ways, that maybe they went a little bit overboard with their design. And this is kind of what I'm getting at, is this wider scope sentiment, which I'm worried going forward that they seem to be just, you know, doomed, right? FromSoftware, they're stuck in a loop of creating something more and more difficult to try and up the challenge and constantly innovate. That's their new way of innovating, in a sense, right? And it's a tough one, because if you don't do something like that, you know, the core hardcore fan base is going to get alienated, they're going to get bored, and there's kind of a lose-lose battle. This is the problem with having a series and a formula which has worked well for so long. Eventually, that people require change. But if the only change you can really add is upping that difficulty and creating more absurd challenges that you start needing to add other players in to even finish them, it's you understand it gets a bit messy. There's no real path out. And I think Elden Ring Night Rain in many ways kind of proves that point too. It was, although it is a spin-off, and I'll fully, you know, admit that, I was a little bit concerned, right? And I haven't played it, and this is kind of the reason why I said earlier multiplayer was never my general, you know, it was never my first port of call for the FromSoft games. I love the solo experience more. So seeing a, you know, co-op dedicated experience for the first time in a standalone project, I was never jumping at the gun to play. You know, that gif of that guy opening the fridge, rubbing his hands together, and then as soon as he sees what's in it, he walks away. That's kind of how I felt when I saw the Night Rain trailer and I started to realize what kind of game it was going to be. And, you know, in a way, I can applaud FromSoftware to some extent, because at least they're trying something different. And I think you can say that with their random new IP, the Duskbloods, which seems to be some sort of PvE formula exclusive to Switch. You know, the jury is very much still out on how that's going to turn out. But generally speaking, FromSoft's track record is pretty damn good. They're one of my favorite game developers of all time, and they create some of my favorite games of all time. Hence why I'm talking about them now. It comes from a place of love. I'm worried to an extent of where the series can go in terms of how much staying power it has left in terms of captivating that audience. Because I feel it. I'm getting tired of that formula, and maybe that's coming down to, you know, the fact that there's so many Souls likes out there, which is what I was originally planning to do this video on, of people copying this formula and redoing it, rehashing it, and again, a lack of real innovation or even ability to match what FromSoftware have ever been able to do, which is, you know, no shame in that, of course. But it just feels like we're reaching many dead ends everywhere we turn in terms of which next project comes out from FromSoftware, outside of the exceptions like Armored Core and things like that. If we're talking strictly about the Souls formula, I'm a bit worried, and who knows where it comes next. I hope it's all good, put it that way, because as I said, Dark Souls 3 remains one of my favorite games of all time. It was the very first video on this channel, so, you know, that should tell you everything. And I don't want to end on too much of a negative note, because as I said, it comes from a place of love. Again, if you have any questions, I want to leave the end videos, end section of the videos that I do on this channel as a Q&A section, where I'll put them on there on the green screen for you to read and for me to answer. So any questions about anything, about me, my love for games, anything for the channel, please don't hesitate to leave them below, and I'll add a little dedicated section here for the next time round. Thank you so much for watching. If you are new here, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, all of that good stuff if you did enjoy me waffling about the games I love and why I love them. Thank you so much again, and I will see you on the next one.